we go. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Institute for Northern Studies Winter Seminar series. God, I can't even speak. This is a great start to the seminar. It's lovely to see you all. Lots of familiar faces in the audience tonight, and a warm welcome to those who are joining us for the very first time. My name is Dr. Andrew Lind. It's my great pleasure to be chairing these seminars. And before I introduce our speaker tonight, I've got a couple of very quick and boring technical points that I just have to very quickly note. The first is just to make everyone aware that tonight's session is being recorded, and you can access the recording and all the recordings of the previous Institute for Northern Studies seminar series on the Institute's YouTube channel. After the paper, we're going to open the floor to questions. So if you have a question at any point during the presentation or afterwards, you can post it via the chat function on the bottom of your screen there. And we would ask that you use the chat function rather than the Q&A function, just because it's easier to keep an eye on, and it makes sure that all the questions are going to the same place. And when you submit those questions, can everyone just make sure that they send them to all panelists? Now, to the reason that you're all here tonight, it's a privilege to welcome Dr. Alison Cathcart to the Institute this evening. Ali is an Associate Professor at the University of Stirling and is very much one of the leading lights of early modern Scottish history, especially in relation to the history of the Highlands and Islands. Her book, Kingship, Clientage, Highland Clanship 1451 to 1609, published in 2006, provided an important and much needed reassessment of the Scottish clans and especially their relationship with the increasingly centralised Stuart state. Since then, Ali's research has primarily looked at the communities and king groups which spanned across the Irish Sea, and in recent times her work has contemplated how island communities across the British archipelago fit into the emerging Scottish state. Now, tonight, Ali will be discussing all of those themes in her paper. They offered to give what they do not even hope to gain: Ireland, Orkney and Shetland, and kingship in the reign of James V. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Ali. Welcome, Ali.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you for a very kind introduction as well. I'm going to start with, forgive me, I'm going to start by sharing my screen, I think is probably the best thing to do, so that you have something to look at rather than just me the whole way through this. There we go. So thank you, Andrew, and thank you all for being here tonight. It's really good of you to give up a Thursday night to come and listen to me. I'm going to start with some usual kind of disclaimers and also some acknowledgements. This is kind of a combination of some much earlier research that I did on James V and the kingship of Ireland, but it's also taken a new direction as Andrew said, I'm starting to explore the island communities within what I call the Atlantic archipelago, and that includes the Channel Islands, the Isle of Man, but also Orkney and Shetland. And it is Orkney and Shetland that will form part of the focus that I'm talking about tonight. I wonder if the title is somewhat misleading. They do feature, but the paper kind of took a slightly different direction. But I do want to acknowledge a few other people. I don't expect any of them to be here tonight, but I want to acknowledge my thanks to Robert Frost, as always, for helping me navigate my way through appropriate reading in Scandinavian history, to Brendan Kane and Sean Duffy for allowing me to read and cite papers prior to their publication, and also to John Ballantyne, who I've never met, but for his huge generosity in sharing with me numerous documents relating to Orkney and Shetland, and most of which I have barely begun to scratch the surface of. So all that said, I will start. And I suppose I'm kicking off with an article published in 1999 by Roger Mason, when he outlined the iconography utilised in the reigns of James III, James IV and James V as a means of conveying that idea of imperial monarchy. And in relation to James V, those views have been reinforced more recently by Andrea Thomas's work. Now, in utilising such iconography, the Scottish monarchy, so Mason argued, was projecting a concept of themselves as a ruler who possessed full jurisdiction and territorial authority within their bounds. Now, no doubt James V was influenced by events of the 1530s in England, where Henry VIII, even if he didn't become a Protestant, did go so far as to break with Rome to secure the divorce he so desperately wanted. But part of James's expression of imperium, argued Mason, was this virtual navigation of the kingdom, as the king led a heavily armed seaborne expedition to Orkney and the Western Isles in 1540. Now, this expedition resulted in a number of interventions in the peripheries beyond the usual warding of Hebridean chiefs. Those interventions included the 1540 Act of Annexation, which saw the North and South Isles, Kintyre, Orkney and Shetland now firmly in Crown hands. The commencement of a survey of these newly acquired Crown lands in the West and a subsequent significant increase in returns to the Crown. The granting of a new tack of Crown lands in Orkney and Shetland to Oliver Sinclair, who was said to be a favourite at court, which also saw significantly increased rental. And James's nomination of Robert Reid, Abbot of Kinloss, as successor to Robert Maxwell, Bishop of Orkney. Taken together, all this chimes really well with Mason's view that the 1540 expedition aimed at ensuring the submission of the outlying regions of his realm. Mason also argues that the closed imperial crown, seen here on the right-hand side, that's King's College, Aberdeen. The closed imperial crown, so evident in the later years of James V's reign, and especially after his sojourn in France over the winter of 1536-7, that also symbolised freedom from external jurisdiction. But beyond the Pope's spiritual jurisdiction and English claims to overlordship over Scotland, that aspect isn't explored in any depth. I must admit, I've always struggled with this idea of the circumnavigation of the realm as a display of imperial monarchy. If your fleet is based at Leith and you go into the Northern and Western Isles, there's no alternative option there in terms of what route you're going to take. But I want to take that 1540 voyage of circumnavigation as an endpoint. And what I want to do this evening is to examine the impact of events elsewhere. And I want to move beyond that all too familiar stomping ground of Scotland's relations with England and France to the neighbouring realms of Ireland and Denmark-Norway. During the 1530s, James was forced to confront the affairs of both kingdoms. And as I'm going to attempt to argue, because this is all quite new research, especially relating to Denmark-Norway, while all that resulted in a voyage of 1540 that, yes, saw him assert his royal authority throughout the peripheries, I'm kind of arguing that James was responding to external stimuli. It was a voyage born out of recognition that his authority really didn't extend across his kingdom, and until that point, an authority he'd actually done very little to exercise directly in his outlying regions. Indeed, his actions during the later years of the 1530s suggest that while he was willing to outwardly project ideas of imperium within his own realm, he really needed to back that up with action on the ground. At the same time, his concept of imperium only extended to freedom from papal jurisdiction, and not, like his grandson James VI and I, to an empire consisting of an aggregation of dominions under his authority. So I'm going to begin with Ireland. In May 1540, news reached Henry VIII from a Scotsman who'd been at court recently that 8 gentlemen of Ireland had been with James V and, quote, brought unto him the seals and underwriting of all the great men in Ireland, that they would hold of him, they'd take him for their king and lord, and that they would come into Scotland to make him homage, and that he should have more profit yearly than ever Henry VIII had. Now, this offer of the kingship of Ireland to James V is often overlooked, both by Scottish and Irish historians, in contrast to offers of the kingship of Ireland made to Philip II of Spain in the 1590s. Now, that offer I'm not going to discuss at this point. The offer to James in the 1540 came after a fairly turbulent time. As you know, the 1530s had witnessed Henry's break from Rome, but it wasn't necessarily that Reformation context that directly caused this offer to James. Rather, it was the result of wider fallout from the Kildare Rebellion that broke out in Ireland in 1534 and rumbled on into 1535, before Thomas Fitzgerald, Lord Offaly, and later 10th Earl of Kildare finally submitted to English authorities. Now, Offaly's main aim in rebelling had been the preservation of the position of his family in Ireland. The removal of the office of Lord Deputy of Ireland from his father had been a factor that directly pushed him into open rebellion, and Offaly sought foreign aid, primarily from Spain and Scotland. In doing so, he sought to capitalise on Henry's recent actions, and he couched his campaign as part of this sort of wider crusade, a wider Catholic crusade against the new Protestant English regime. This was largely opportunistic. It wasn't really until after the rebellion of the outbreak by Offaly that Spain showed any interest in Ireland. Charles V had kind of been negotiating with the papacy over like who's going to act first, who's really going to take Henry to court to hand, Henry VIII to hand for all of this. And so Charles saw this rebellion in Ireland as an opportunity, as he said, to embarrass Henry in his own country. In other words, it was a way for Charles to cause trouble for Henry without himself having to get involved directly. But some Irish lords actually wanted direct intervention by Charles. During the course of the Kildare Rebellion, Conor O'Brien of Thomond wrote to Charles explaining, quote, "Our predecessors for a long time quietly and peacefully occupied Ireland. They possessed and governed this country in a manner royal, as by our ancient chronicles doth plainly appear. Our predecessors and ancestry did come from your Majesty's realm of Spain, where they were of the blood of a Spanish prince. And many kings of that lineage in long succession governed all Ireland happily until it was conquered by the English. We have never been subject to English rule or yielded up our ancient rights and liberties. And there is at this present and forever will be perpetual discord between us, and we will continually harass them with war." The message was quite clear. O'Brien was emphasising the Iberian origins of the Irish, but he also argued that the claims of the English crown to sovereignty over Ireland were unfounded because the Irish had never yielded their ancient rights and liberties. And yet, little tangible support was coming from Charles. Now, there's no doubt Charles was very satisfied with the fact that the Kildare Rebellion resulted in widespread unrest across the country, but it eventually petered out. Offaly, who briefly became Earl of Kildare after his father died in the Tower in September 1534, submitted to English authorities in August 1535. Along with his 5 uncles, he was sent to the Tower, where they remained until they were executed in 1537. The response in Ireland to these events was the emergence of the Geraldine League, formed around Gerald Fitzgerald, a half-brother of Offaly and the only remaining member of the family. And it sought to restore young Gerald to the Kildare inheritance, as the family were forfeit of their estates after the outbreak of rebellion. Now, no doubt for many who later joined, both the Kildare Rebellion and the subsequent Geraldine League were vehicles, a means of capitalising on the momentum and allowing them to rebel against the imposition of English authority. But the rebellion ended, the Geraldine League finally petered out, and Irish lords one by one made their peace. Some did so rather much earlier than others. Indeed, as early as October 1535, just a few months after the submission of Offaly and the formal ending of the Kildare Rebellion, the very same Conor O'Brien who'd written to Charles V earlier in the year wrote to Henry VIII, promising his obedience and loyalty and justifying his recent actions in the rebellion, which included asserting he had been counselled by light people. He also added, "As for the receiving of Thomas Fitzgerald into my country, I assure you that I never sent for him, but I could not for very shame refuse him of meat and drink, for it hath been of old custom among Irishmen to give meat and drink and such like goods as we have." The later section of the letter is even more interesting, where once again O'Brien emphasises Irish custom. He again declares his own loyalty and adds that he and his ancestors have always done right good service to the king's deputies in Ireland. And he asked, "If it would please your grace to be so good and gracious to this poor land, and to us your poor subjects, as to send some nobleman to govern us, and especially if it would please your highness to send your son, the Duke of Richmond, to this poor country. I ensure your grace that I and my brother and all my kinsmen with all my friends shall do him service as true as any man living. And I, my kinsmen and friends, shall right gladly receive him to our foster son after the custom of Ireland, and shall live and die in his right and service forever. Now, O'Brien had been described to Thomas Cromwell as the greatest and the strongest man of power, the chief captain of all Irishmen. So perhaps the English might have listened to what he said. Either way, it's not really clear what O'Brien's agenda was. It's possible the Irish lords looked to the Duke of Richmond as an alternative, one who had experience of wider European affairs. Perhaps they simply hoped for a monarch who might actually live in Ireland and who they could turn to settle disputes between the warring Irish lords themselves. Or perhaps they simply wanted to be free from an English-born Lord Deputy unsympathetic to Irish customs and culture. The proposal by O'Brien that they would accept the Duke of Richmond as foster son perhaps speaks to that. Indeed, O'Brien's communication suggests that while English rule was still acceptable, what was not acceptable was Thomas Cromwell's level of interference or the policies of either the new English-born Lord Deputy William Skeffington or Lord Leonard Grey, Marshal of the English Army in Ireland. Fosterage was the custom prevalent in Ireland, but O'Brien's suggestion that the Duke of Richmond be received as our foster son, it kind of turns that view of educating the Irish in the ways of the English on its head. In this instance, the Duke of Richmond would be regarded as the foster son, and thus, by implication, perhaps the Irish planned to bring him up and educate him in Irish ways, customs and laws. Understandably, little came of this suggestion as the Duke of Richmond died in the summer of 1536, and still little tangible support came from Charles V. Meanwhile, in 1538, Pope Paul III wrote to Con O'Neill of Tyrone, styling him our noble king of the realm of Ireland. Now, there were rumours at that time that Con sought to proclaim himself king, but these appear to have started in England. Paul III argued that Henry VIII had fallen from the Mother Church of Rome and therefore was no longer fit to rule over the Irish, and so there was no reason on O'Neill's part to stay loyal to him. At that point, however, O'Neill made no effort to follow through with any such claims to the kingship or even to try to revive the high kingship of Ireland. And that's an indication of the reality of the ground. Paul III, the Pope, might have wanted O'Neill to do that, but Con O'Neill was in no position to do so, nor was it likely that other Irish lords would accept him as the Irish High King. Indeed, O'Brien's suggestion of the Duke of Richmond as king is evidence perhaps of a realisation on his part, perhaps of some of the other Irish, that actually there could never be an internal solution, that the Irish high kingship was something that had been in the past, but actually could never be revived because they were constantly fighting amongst themselves. And thus that ensured there would always be ongoing offers of the kingship to monarchs elsewhere in Europe. So the involvement in Irish affairs by James V in the 1530s perhaps persuaded some of the Irish lords then to consider approaching him with an offer of the Irish kingship. I won't go into the details here. James had been involved in Ireland throughout the 1530s, largely through, to begin with, his relationship with his own West Highland chiefs, especially Alexander MacDonald of Donaghadee, who he'd been in communication with while Alexander was in Ireland in his lands in the Glens. He then had written to the Pope on behalf of Manus O'Donnell, one of the Irish lords in Ulster. So he had been involved quite a bit in Irish affairs, largely Ulster affairs, during the 1530s. And that, as I said, may have been the reason why the Irish lords turned up at the Scottish court to offer him the kingship in 1540. Despite the increased projection of concepts of imperial monarchy during the latter part of his reign, James chose not to take up the offer of making that tangible. As I've already argued elsewhere, I think James had already decided to quietly withdraw from Irish affairs. I think that the rather brutal execution of the Kildare family members in 1537 had encouraged him to do that. He was, however, urged by Pope Paul III in February 1541 to consider the weal of Ireland, which has a claim upon James's loyalty and touches his reputation. But by 1541, it was a little too late. Henry VIII would soon pass his Act for the Kingly Title, which saw Ireland's constitutional position change almost overnight from that of a lordship to that of a kingdom. Now, while there's been little discussion of the offer of the kingship to James, there's been even less connection made, and I'm guilty of this myself, even less connection made between the offer of 1540 to James and the Act for the Kingly Title passed by Henry VIII in 1541, as if those two events, coming 1 year after the other, had actually no bearing on each other. I mean, when you think about, well, when I think about it, there can be no doubt that the news of the offer of the kingship of Ireland to James V provoked Henry into action. And in doing so, he listened to members of his old English community in Ireland who persuaded him of the benefits of declaring himself king. They said, look, that this would make your Irish subjects bind themselves to you, there would be less chance of rebellion, and it was all painted in a very positive light. What I want to go on now to discuss are the other external factors that caused Henry to declare himself King of Ireland, and events that in turn had ensured that James had turned down that offer of the kingship of Ireland. So I want to turn now to Orkney and Shetland, but that also means Denmark-Norway. And this is where I'm on less solid ground. This is all fairly new. The betrothal and marriage of James III to Margaret, daughter of Christian I of Denmark-Norway, over 1468 to 69, saw the cancelling of the debt Scotland owed for Hebrides and the Isle of Man, but it also saw the islands of Orkney and Shetland mortgaged to the Scottish Crown. Now, at times, and I'm guilty of this, at times it's been regarded as a rather definite incorporation of the Northern Isles into the Scottish kingship, but that was very far from the case, and Ian Gross's work has highlighted that beautifully. Now, the Crown of Denmark-Norway was both elective and hereditary. Following their election, all monarchs had to sign up to certain conditions before their coronation, and monarchs were bound by the conditions of their election charters and ruled alongside a council. The Norwegian Council of the Realm were far from happy that Christian I of Denmark and Norway had pledged the islands, as they believed he had no such right to do so. Indeed, a condition of Christian I's election charter of 1449 stated that he was not to pledge or alienate the kingdom's castles, fiefs or rents unless there be a demand and necessity, and only according to the advice of Norway's Council of the Realm, lest, God forbid, the kingdom should therewith incur damages. The Council of the Realm clearly understood Orkney and Shetland to have been in and therefore should return to Norwegian hands. And in both documents concerning the mortgaging of Orkney and Shetland, Christian I asserted his right to redeem the islands until the whole and full payment was made by his heirs and successors, kings of Norway, to the aforesaid James, his heirs and successors. In 1482, the Norwegian Council began demanding that Orkney and Shetland should be redeemed, and in 1583, at his coronation, King Hans made an oath that he would take steps to redeem Orkney and Shetland. In fact, the election charters of Hans in 1483, Christian II in 1513, Frederick I in 1523, and Christian III in 1534 all included the obligation to reclaim Orkney and Shetland for the Crown. Actually, such a clause continued to appear in election charters until the later 17th century, but I'm not going there tonight. Meanwhile, the 1468-9 marriage treaty had included a mutual defence alliance between Christian I and James III, which compelled both the Oldenburg and Stuart houses to provide help, aid and assistance, each in his turn, at the request of the other, against whatsoever prince or prince's nation of people that threatened them. The alliance was renewed on a number of occasions by Hans and James IV, but the obligation of this treaty came into play more fully during the minority and personal reign of James V. In seeking support from Christian II in 1514, John Stuart, Duke of Albany and regent during James's minority, offered to return the islands in exchange for 6,000 armed men. In February 1523-4, Albany again was requesting aid, this time from Frederick I. Albany made it clear that if money was provided, repayment would be secured on Orkney and Shetland. Now, nothing ever came of these negotiations, but that was less to do with the Norwegian desire to reclaim or redeem Orkney and Shetland, and more to do with the internal situation in Denmark that prevented such a course of action. Indeed, from 1523 through to 1536, Denmark-Norway was experiencing significant internal unrest, and explains why, even though it was offered, Frederick I was in no position to try to redeem the islands. This internal dissent that engulfed Denmark, Norway and Sweden in the 1520s and 30s spilled over to impact neighbouring states, and it had repercussions across the archipelago as well. Christian II succeeded his father in 1513, but his reign didn't exactly go well, especially in Sweden, where he tried to forcibly revive the Kalmar Union. In 1522, Sweden left the Kalmar Union after an event known as the Stockholm Bloodbath, which kind of suggests that, unsurprisingly, it was an event that did little to endear Christian to the Swedes. While in 1522, he set up a Danish-centred trading company, which also directly impacted on Swedish trade. In 1523, Christian II was deposed when a gathering of the Danish parliament offered the crown to his uncle, the Duke of Holstein, hence Frederick I, and Christian fled into exile. He later mounted an invasion attempt. He landed at Oslo. He was initially well received, but he couldn't subdue the north of Norway. And Frederick appeared to offer him a safe conduct, but instead he just captured him, imprisoned him in various castles. And so Christian II remains, and does remain, a captive until his death in 1559. But his very existence ensured that Frederick was going to face ongoing opposition. And actually, from the time of Christian's deposition of 1523 right through until 1536, when the war eventually ended, Denmark-Norway is experiencing nothing short of a civil war. It resulted in repeated requests to the Scots for assistance, both from the exiled Christian II and from Frederick I. Support was rarely forthcoming. The Scots always cited bad timing, having to deal with rebels in the Isles, or English attacks as justification for not sending aid. Now, this internal unrest was exacerbated by the wider Reformation context and the issue of succession. Frederick died in 1533, but it wasn't clear initially who was going to succeed him. The council decided to postpone election for 1 year, and they would rule instead. Now, following that interregnum, the crown was finally offered to Frederick's son, Christian, Duke of Holstein, who later became Christian III. His election, however, was far from unanimous. The remaining supporters of Christian II had allied with Lubeckers, and together they were opposing Christian III's kingship. Now, the Lubeckers had long-standing grievances against Denmark-Norway, as during the previous decades they had lost a lot of their trading privileges. And so they sought to exploit the situation in Denmark-Norway and the wider Reformation context to achieve their own ends. And in doing so, they opened negotiations with Henry VIII, casting him as their ally. Ambassadors from Lubeck and Hamburg first arrived at the English court in late June 1534, after Christian III had been proclaimed King of Denmark. And over the course of the next 12 months, there was ongoing communication concerning the situation in Denmark. The Lubeckers praised Henry for his break with Rome, and there were discussions concerning doctrinal issues, including the question of the sacrament. I'm not entirely sure how interested Henry was in those discussions, but he engaged with them anyway. But while they may have exploited wider confessional issues to gain access to Henry VIII, it's clear that their agenda was more political than confessional. And ultimately, they declared that they sought to elect a king of Denmark who would be wholly at their devotion, and offered Henry the quiet possession of Denmark. Their overarching aim was ultimately the restoration of trading and other privileges that they had previously enjoyed, but essentially they do so by offering Henry the crown of Denmark. Now, Henry is intrigued by these proposals. He thinks that it would thwart Charles V's purposes in the continent, and he engaged with them in negotiations over the winter of 1534 to 35. Now, I'm sure Henry was ambitious enough to consider the possibility of becoming King of Denmark. It wasn't just about frustrating Charles V further. So, as I said, he's engaged the Lubeckers over the winter of 1534 to 5, but between February and June 1535, Peter Sylvanus, who was secretary to Christian III, was sent to England to negotiate for a peace treaty between the English, Denmark and the Lubeckers. Now, I'm not going into the details of that peace treaty. It is important, but it's not really. Much more interesting, actually, than what I want to discuss is the wide-ranging discussions between these two men. So you've got Henry, who's been offered the crown of Denmark by men from Lubeck, which should already raise a question mark. And you've got Peter Sylvanus, who's the secretary of Christian III, who is fighting essentially a civil war. Now, as Sylvanus was negotiating on part on Christian III, obviously the crown of Denmark wasn't on the table. But he argued that if Henry paid the sum required to redeem Orkney and Shetland, he believed the islands could be handed over, and on the same conditions, while Iceland also could perhaps be pledged to Henry. At this point, Henry appears to have stalled a little, weighing up his both sides of both offers that he had. He extolled Christian III, but he remarked to Sylvanus that he was concerned about going back on his promises. Plus, Henry argued, Christian II had the greatest right to recover Denmark. Now, obviously, Sylvanus doesn't agree, and he sought to emphasise the real agenda of the Lubeckers, but also began to explain to Henry why he was wrong. Brave man. Sylvanus pointed out that the Council of Denmark had not driven Christian II from the kingdom without the best reasons, nor had Christian kept the articles to which he had sworn. And he went on to explain to Henry the nature of the elective kingship in Denmark, highlighting that Danish kings were created with certain conditions. If they did not keep what they swore to, the people were free to revolt from them, nor did they do fealty to their king except on these conditions. Now, I think clearly until this point in the discussion, Henry had really not fully appreciated the hereditary and elective nature of the kings of Denmark-Norway. When he did, and when the reality of what the offer of kingship entailed, in other words, that it was conditional, he uttered only 3 words, "O wretched king." Now, he spoke those words, "O wretched king," I think in relation to Christian II, but they also adequately describe, I think, how Henry probably viewed the situation in general. You might want to consider that given his recent actions in breaking with Rome, as well as a fairly sustained rebellion in Ireland, perhaps he might have reflected that had he been held to such high account, he might well have been found wanting. Either way, following and immediately following this conversation, Henry began to actively work towards peace, offering friendship to the Duke of Holstein. So working towards peace, but not quite recognising Christian III as Christian III, calling him instead the Duke of Holstein. Sylvanus then went north to visit James V and his court, and in response to requests from both Christian III and Sylvanus, James said he would duly advise his uncle to divert his mind from Danish ambitions and cease to favour the men of Lubeck against Christian. James did this, but in truth his behaviour was no better than that of his uncle. He actually offered little more than platitudes and fairly empty gestures to both sides. James would not have welcomed the prospect of Henry VIII becoming King of Denmark, but it was highly unlikely. Indeed, as Sylvanus commented to James regarding the situation, the Lubeckers were not justified in offering to Henry the Danish kingdom, to which Christian III was freely elected, adding that the Lubeckers offered to give what they do not even hope to gain. But no doubt James would have been concerned by the suggestion that if Henry could, he could redeem Orkney and Shetland, and he could hold them, possibly also with Iceland. James was well aware of that mutual defence alliance established between the Stuart and the Oldenburg houses that he had done very little to uphold. He would also have been well aware that Denmark-Norway retained the right to redeem Orkney and Shetland, and thus they could possibly be redeemed. The wider situation made that redemption unlikely in the near future. The war ended in 1536 when the Lübeckers finally withdrew support for Christian II, while Christian III also allied with Gustav Vasa of Sweden, which enabled him to defeat his opponents. But the country was absolutely financially spent by years of warfare. And regardless of how much Christian III might have wanted to redeem Orkney and Shetland, it just wasn't going to be possible. So James was relatively unconcerned, perhaps unconcerned enough to be distracted by heading off to France and getting married, and also being married again in 1538 to Marie de Guise-Lorraine. Soon, however, he started to pay attention to domestic matters once more. And finally, I want to get back to that 1540 circumnavigation. Having said all that, too often we look for domestic causes, or perhaps too often I have looked for domestic causes for this circumnavigation. Yes, we can call it a grand display of imperial monarchy. In the past, I've pointed to the rebellion of Donald Gorham MacDonald in 1539 in the Western Isles as a stimulus. Jamie Cameron has argued that various grants of land and remissions that preceded his expedition suggest that it had been planned for a few years. Meanwhile, the situation in Orkney and Shetland had been something of a concern to James since 1536, with the death of James Sinclair of Brex, but James was now resolved to act. To be sure, a royal expedition to the Northern and Western Isles could not prevent Christian III from redeeming Orkney and Shetland if he'd so wanted to, but I think it's evidence that James clearly sought to assert his royal authority more fully throughout the Isles. The visit of a number of Irish lords to the Scottish court shortly before his departure with the offer of the Irish kingship may have been little more than a coincidence. The recent offer of Denmark to Henry VIII by the Lübeckers was probably still fairly fresh in James's mind, and the words of Suetonius ringing in his ears, James may well have considered that it was true also of the Irish, that they offered to give what they do not even hope to gain. Indeed, the suggestion by Conor O'Brien to Henry VIII in 1535 to send the Duke of Richmond to Ireland speaks to that. As I said, an awareness that the Irish could never agree on an Irish king, so they look for someone outside of Ireland. But would they even also agree on that? Now, this all raises questions of elective kingship. While that had been and remained the tradition in Denmark-Norway, was it also true of Ireland? Sure, there had been the High Kingship of Ireland, but the last individual to hold that position was Rory O'Connor just prior to the Norman arrival and takeover of Ireland. There had been sporadic attempts to revive the High Kingship, but no Irish chief really could hope to establish his authority again over the entire island. More recently, Brendan Kane has argued that in the 1590s, O'Neill of Tyrone and O'Donnell of Tyrconnell sought to confer the kingship on another individual, but retained claims to sovereignty, ensuring that they could tear them down and start again. And he makes that distinction between kingship as in the office of the king and sovereignty as in the execution of the rights and claims that go with that. As such, Kane argues, their inspiration was always Warwick and not Brian Boru. But that's a later example, and so what can we say about earlier evidence for elective kingship in Ireland? The 1317 Irish Remonstrance, although not exactly an expression of elective kingship, is rarely mentioned, and indeed rarely mentioned partly by historians, but also in any discussions of these offers of kingship. The remonstrance referred to the papal bull laudabiliter granted to Henry II by Adrian IV, by which Henry entered Ireland promising to preserve the rights of the Irish Church and improve the lives of the people, but in fact did quite the opposite. While the author of the sister document, the Declaration of Arbroath, was able to depict Robert Bruce's kingship as a fait accompli, the Irish had more of an uphill battle and simply asked the Pope to approve their setting up of Edward Bruce as King and Lord in Ireland. Nonetheless, it was evidence that the Irish lords, or at least one Irish lord, Donald O'Neill, were asserting their right to choose someone else as king. What other evidence do we have? Well, there's little discussion of the late 15th or early 16th century second life of St Médach that refers to the inauguration of the kings of Breffni. As Catherine Sims had noted, it suggests the conferring of kingship is conditional on his carrying out his undertakings, although that discussion could be interpreted in purely judicial or spiritual context, so it is somewhat ambiguous. In Scotland, debates about elective monarchy or contractual kingship don't really come to the fore until the later 16th century, as both John Knox and George Buchanan sought to wrestle with ungodly or Catholic monarchy and the deposition of Mary Queen of Scots, respectively. Nonetheless, neither James nor his uncle would have entertained such ideas concerning their royal authority, given their outward projection of concepts of imperial monarchy. But these events in relation to Ireland and Denmark-Norway ensured that when the offer came, James had absolutely no intention of accepting it. After all, what conditions might he be bound by? That said, they certainly brought home to James the need to govern his entire realm more effectively. As a result, I might suggest this circumnavigation of his realm was less another outward projection of his royal authority, but actually a voyage he undertook because he knew he had to take action to be an effective presence in his outlying regions, the Western and Northern Isles, and to secure those regions from external intervention. I am going to stop soon. I have gone on long enough, I think. But there's one other further point I want to throw out, and I genuinely haven't done enough research on this yet, but it comes clear to me, and it becomes increasingly clear to me the more I look at this, is that there is also a significant economic agenda at play here. I mentioned at the outset the 1540 expedition that sees a Crown survey undertaken of lands in the Western Isles, which resulted in increased rentals there, and some areas paying rent for the first time. After the expedition, also Orkney rents increase, and when he grants them to James Sinclair of James Oliver of Pitcairn, sorry, is where I'm going, another Sinclair, you see his rental increase significantly, whereas previous rental accounts were just under £400 per annum. His first payment is over £1,000. There's quite a significant increase here. But it's not just increased crown rentals in both the Northern and Western Isles. James is also, throughout his realm, hugely concerned with exploring mining in Scotland. And again, this is something I've always associated with James VI, not James V. Now, there's no doubt in this respect, James V is influenced by Christian II. He had sought to take over the mining region in Sweden. It was part of why he'd been so forcibly trying to renew the Kalmar Union, I think. He was Christian II had tried to take that over and had real agenda there. And throughout James's reign, you see him bringing in metal workers, employing them from Denmark and Germany and elsewhere to try and find areas in Scotland where he could begin extractive mining. So there's that James has deliberately got people here employed in Scotland looking into this, but also, and again, something else I've always associated with James VI, is James starts to try to protect the fishing around his northern coast and the Northern Isles, writing to various individuals across in Scandinavia and Germanic states, requesting that foreign fishermen did not invade his waters and bounds with intent to deprive Scots by illegal methods of the fruit of their toil on their coast without first consulting with him. He's consciously setting out to try and protect those waters from foreigners to ensure that the Scots have control of the fishing. It's not exactly clear to me yet why James sought to increase crown revenue, apart from the obvious reasons. He's always wanted to increase crown revenue. But what he wants to spend that on, in the light of the events of the 1530s, I might suggest that James realised he needed to invest in a stronger naval force in order to secure his kingdom. Yes, he constantly was telling Christian II or Christian III that he couldn't send aid, he couldn't supply any assistance because he didn't have the shipping or he didn't have the men. Now, that might have been just an excuse, or maybe actually it was the truth, and James decided he needed to do something about it. Either way, I think the events of the 1530s bring home to him perhaps something of the fragility of monarchical rule, and as I said, the need to invest in a stronger naval force to secure his kingdom from external threats. And if so, perhaps, unfortunately, right at the beginning of his reign, James actually was beginning to put ideas of imperial monarchy into practice on the ground. Thank you. I will stop there.
There we go. Sorry, my camera was very slow in booting up there. Thank you very much, Ali. That was fascinating. There's lots of questions coming to mind. I would just invite everyone that if they do have questions that they can pop them in the chat. But while they're coming in, I might customarily abuse my position as chair. Oh no, David's beat me to it. We've got one from David Worthington. An excellent and original paper, Ali, thanks. The combined North Channel, North Sea perspective on mid-16th century Scottish politics is totally convincing and one that would be helpful to see applied to other periods. I wondered if you'd considered the soon-to-emerge policy in Ireland of St. Leger, known as surrender and regrant today, as influenced by this context too, so an ongoing concern about James V's ambitions in relation to the Gaelic Irish until 1542 and his death.
Oh, that's interesting, David. Thank you for the question. Sorry, I'm reading it as well, so I can get it into my head. Yeah, I mean, the surrender and regrant policy, oh, I could talk about this for hours. Yeah, I mean, it's all combined with Henry's agenda of, I mean, he's totally, so he buys into the Old English view that he needs to, you know, become king of Ireland, partly because that bull laudabiliter. So by breaking with Rome, he literally metaphorically tears up the papal bull that gives the English the right to be in Ireland in the first place. And so he has to do something else to justify their position there. But the Old English sell it to him in sort of terms of, Henry for a long time has tried to negotiate with Ireland. Actually, he really has. He's tried to do that. And so they sell it to him on these grounds that if you pass the Kingship of Ireland Act, they will be more obedient. And the surrender and regrant that St. Leger comes up with is a way of, you know, building on that and making those Irish chiefs bound to Henry much more. You know, hand your lands back, lands that the English don't believe they should hold anyway, and we will grant them back to you. So you now hold them from the king. There's very little mention of religion in the surrender and regrant policy, which I find really interesting. There's no obligation on them to convert, but it is all about holding them from the king, obedience to the king over and above, well, it's obedience to the king over and above papal supremacy. There is that, which is quite a crucial point. But I do think James has withdrawn from Ireland by this point. I think the surrender and regrant is all about what Henry's trying to do in relation to his Irish lords. I mean, it's a massively counterproductive policy, and Elizabeth finds that out to her cost. But I still think James has withdrawn. I think James is confident to the point of arrogance in his relationship with his uncle, the way he treats him, and even up until, you know, when they agreed to go to York, and then James just wasn't bothered turning up. You can't, you know, you just don't do that with Henry VIII, but he does. But I think he genuinely has withdrawn from Ireland in terms of his interest there. And I'd always just thought about that in terms of an Irish context, but since looking at Denmark-Norway, I can't ignore that anymore. That James is fully involved in all those negotiations, understands that, and so it's a sense of saying, well, Henry could potentially redeem Orkney and Shetland for me. Let's not get involved in Ireland, because that could just make everything so much worse. If that makes sense, David. That's kind of what I'm thinking. I just didn't have time to go there, but I think it impacts on each other. I don't know for certain, but I can't help but think that James is kind of, I really don't want Henry to redeem Orkney and Shetland. Those are my islands. He does. He sees them as part of the Scottish crown. Or Christian could redeem them if he wants to, but he certainly doesn't want Henry doing that. So I think that's the first time he thinks that this is where not to aggravate Henry any further.
That's really interesting, because the thing that struck me there, and actually links into David's point, is to wheel out a kind of aged and dogged argument about the periphery. Something like this completely questions that notion entirely, both in terms of the geopolitics of what's going on in this period, and in terms of actually political thought and political development in Scotland in this period. And just, I would be interested to hear your thoughts, especially considering what goes on in Denmark-Norway to what's going on with James in terms of his relationship with Orkney and Shetland, but also the Western Isles. Is this further evidence that we need to really scrap this idea about there being a periphery?
Well, I argue that all the time. Yeah, in the either we're all peripheries or we're all centres. It's an unhelpful way of looking at it. I mean, you can be peripheral in terms of geographic terms, but that's when you don't take a maritime perspective. The Western Isles and Orkney are certainly peripheral to Norway or to Denmark-Norway, that's for sure. I mean, it's interesting. I was a bit unfair to James in my paper saying he hadn't really bothered with the Western Isles up until now. He had. He'd engaged with Alexander MacDonald of Donegal and the Glens. He'd maintained communication with him, and he'd actually, given him responsibility in the Western Isles for a period, but he hadn't gone there. He hadn't done anything more than that. He kind of delegated, which is what his father did. James IV delegated and was relatively successful in that. But absolutely, I think 1540 is and I suppose the view that it's a circumnavigation of some kind of projection of imperial authority doesn't sit well with me, because I think, yes, it's an absolute expression of monarchical authority, but done from a position of, oh, I need to do something here because I don't want to lose these lands. And when I start to see the economic agenda as well, the concern over the fishing, the increase in crown rentals, they're these are crucial parts of their kingdom, financially, but also he doesn't want Henry to redeem Orkney and Shetland. These are not just peripheral lands that, it doesn't really matter. He'd rather hold on to Orkney and Shetland than accept the kingship of Ireland. Potentially, you could look at it like that. He doesn't want to see Henry redeem them, so let's not interfere in Ireland. So yeah, the view that these are just peripheral and not really important to Scotland.
Yeah, very much linked into that, actually. There's a question from Anus McCoynig asking, does the timing of Rory MacLeod of Lewis's second marriage to Barbara Stewart of Orkney, daughter of Lord Avondale, around 1540, presumably with royal conveyance, feed into this increasing royal engagement with Western and Northern peripheries?
Yeah, absolutely. She said. James has his eye on Orkney from 1536. There is, you probably all know this, I've not really paid much attention to Orkney. She says, guilty as charged, until I spent a wonderful summer learning more about Denmark-Norway and everything than I thought I ever would. But James is paying attention to Orkney from 1536 from 1529 when there is a so-called family squabble amongst the Sinclairs. 1536 when James Sinclair Brex, who's kind of in control, then commits suicide. And it's just left. But from 38, 39, 40, yeah, I see James becoming more and more involved there. And again, it's one of those, it's a shame, well, it's a shame he dies for lots of reasons, but I would love to have seen what he would have done. I mean, it's interesting, Mary of Guise, very quickly after James dies, she gets in and takes control, and starts granting lands and taking revenues and stuff. She's not letting it go because it was part of her, it was part of her jointure with James V. So she's in there really quickly. But I think, yes, James is, I would say, I think 1536 is a really important year, but I think from 1538 we start to see him, that's when he starts issuing remissions to people in the Western Isles to try and bring them on board. And I think we can start to see him paying attention much more to Orkney from there on in as well. And I think that the expedition is being planned from that time onwards. It's just a matter of when.
That's very interesting, yeah. I mean, I guess because the Battle of Somerdale is 1529, when the two branches of Sinclair. So is that a deliberate policy from James, do you think, in the 30s, that he kind of realises that he needs to assert himself? And is that relating to, needing to assert himself as king of these places? Or is it kind of one eye on the bank balance in terms of that age-old Stuart obsession with trying to get the Highlands and Islands to turn a profit?
Yeah, I don't think, I think until 1536, like I said, 1536 is a kind of important year. I mean, that's when Alexander MacDonald of Donevaig and the Glens dies. But by that stage, James is already involved with Manus O'Donnell and Tyrconnell, so he's involved there. 1529 is annoying for him. I think because there's this squabble going on in Orkney, and that's when, and Jamie Cameron argues this, that's when James is trying to assert his own authority. So it's like, seriously, guys, not now, really. I don't do this right now. And that's why I think he just allows James Sinclair of Brex to continue to run things. There's no formal acknowledgement of that until 1535, and then he commits suicide in 1536. It's like, oh, what? So I think that's when you start to see him pay more attention.
Right.
And that's fair enough. Up until then, he has had a traumatic few years trying to establish his own authority. And he's kind of let the Isles just do their own thing. And he's been involved, but from a distance. I think from 1536, especially from 1538 onwards, that's when he's starting to kind of go, I need to do something here. Because in the background, you had this offer to Henry VIII, that's going on 1534, 35. The war, or the civil war in Denmark-Norway, comes to an end in 1536. Okay, Christian III financially isn't in a position to do anything, but if he could, and I think that's when James is going, I need to do something, because they could redeem them if they wanted to. And I think he's trying to make it so that won't happen. If there's enough rebellion and unrest going on, that I think that would encourage Denmark-Norway to do something about it. But I think if James is pacifying and showing himself to be, providing good governance, that would not happen. Yeah.
Provides them with legitimacy, doesn't it? Yeah. I'm just checking the chat. We don't have anything sitting there, so if anyone does have any questions or thoughts, please do fire them up. There we go. So we've got one from Katie McGregor. I'll just read that out for everyone. Thank you, Ali, for an amazing paper. As you know, I'm doing my PhD on James V's foreign policy during his adult rule, and currently looking a lot at Scoto-Danish-Norwegian relations in the earliest part of James's personal rule in particular. I was very intrigued by your emphasis on James V's concern with mining, as I do know that Christian II in exile was attempting to get involved in Scottish mining, presumably to get money in any way possible. My question is whether there is any evidence of a contemporary reaction by Christian II of Denmark-Norway of James V's circumnavigation itself, presumably within the context of increasing fishing disputes with Scandinavian and German states. The idea of a Scottish king sailing to the islands of Orkney and Shetland could have a political and emotive effect on relations to Scotland.
Hi, Kate. Thank you for that. I'd love to say yes, but I don't. From what I have gathered, so far, and I get a lot of this. I feel I'm still scratching the surface, so I'm delighted that you're doing something with it. I really am, because I think there's masses out there. And the only thing I see Christian writing to James about is requests for help. Really, I don't see him engaging with him about fishing or about mining. But actually, when you go through the evidence, it keeps coming up time and time again, that there is a real economic agenda. But yeah, absolutely, Christian II had that mining. That's why he wanted to take it over that region of Sweden. I just can't pronounce it, and I will make a dog's dinner if I try to. That northern part of Sweden, where which was a long established mining region, that's what he wants Sweden for. And when he sets up that trading company, that interferes with trade for Sweden and the Lubeckers, and that's where the alliance between the Lubeckers and Swedes come from. They're both financially and hampered by that in terms of their trade. So I don't know of any contemporary evidence relating to Christian's response to that. I would love to, and if I ever find out, I will send it to you. Absolutely. There's and it's not really related at all, but there's a lovely response by Christian III, actually, which has nothing to do with mining or fishing, but it's beautiful. I think because it's quite direct for monarchs of this time, they always gloss it in such lovely formal, polite language. That James and Henry always called each other beloved uncle and dearest nephew when actually they couldn't stand each other, that kind of thing. And James has gone off, got married, come back, and Madeline has died. And Christian III writes to him saying, really sorry to hear about Madeline's death, but, and then you get this kind of, Denmark-Norway the country is spent, financially ruined, blah, blah, blah. And then it goes on to this, and it's a pretty stinging rebuke for James V, where he says something along the lines of, it's interesting to me to have seen so many monarchs of wealth and status in Europe stand by and watch somebody who's been rightfully elected, dispelled from their lands, despite their claims to success. I can't remember. I should have somewhere here, but I won't bother looking at it. But he's essentially saying, I'm gobsmacked that you lot stood by and did nothing, essentially, quite literally nothing, while I was literally deprived of my lands. And I think that as well was quite interesting. That comes in August, I think, 1537. And it was quite direct for James, and I think he's just gone, oh, okay, yeah, you saw through that. You saw through all my, kind of, oh yes, but I've got the trouble in the Isles, and I've got this, that, and the other, and I can't really do anything. And Christian's really quite direct with him, and it's just the way he words it about somebody being ejected from their rightful lands and nobody doing anything. I just think all of these conversations and all of this communication will have an impact. So sorry, Kate, I've gone off on a complete tangent there, but no, I don't have any contemporary evidence of Christian II's reaction regarding the circumnavigation. To be fair, I haven't looked beyond that. I've been focusing really on the 1530s up until now, so I haven't gone into the 1540s. There must be some, I assume. Like I said, if I find any, I'll send it your way.
Yeah, that reaction's got lots of foreshadowing of 1649 written all over it, where everybody seems to be doing their laundry when poor old Charles is put on trial. That must just be a monarch thing.
Yeah, you're very good at it.
Yeah. We do still have time if anyone has any other questions. I might abuse my position again to ask another question of you, Ali, sorry. Anouis has beat me to it. Anouis, as I said, always been intrigued by the mooted expulsion of Clan Chattan at the beginning of James V's reign and exiles surviving members to Norway and parts of Scandinavia. Where does this come from in the context of Scoto-Danish relations? Really interesting question.
Yeah, it is, and I don't think I can answer it, which is awful.
It's a tough one, yeah.
I should know everything about the Clan Hatton in 1528. It was actually, but that was the early Moray, Okay, that was actually during James's fifth minority, just at the very end of his minority, but it was the Earl of Moray who was doing that. But then, you know, if you look in Ireland, I know it's 1528, but by, you know, 1590s, the English administration is saying, well, we'll just send all these Irish off to Sweden. You know, they can just go and fight. You just send them off to Sweden. And it's not the same thing, because by then, you know, Swedes were looking for mercenary soldiers. You know, that's what they were intended to do. It was a letter of fire and sword that's issued in the name of James V, but actually done by the Earl of Moray. Right. Which I find interesting, because James V earlier had granted Orkney to the Earl of Moray, and he'd done nothing for a year, had done nothing, and then they just gave it back to Lady Sinclair. So yeah, Eunice, I'm sorry, I can't actually answer that. I don't know. But they didn't go through with it, as you know. But where that fits in terms of Scottish-Danish relations, I don't know. Sorry.
That's interesting. It feels like there may be something there as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll just give it a second to see if anyone else has any questions.
I'm not going to go away and find out, Ernest, and let you know. I figure
that's another paper.
Yeah.
We'll get you back after Christmas, and you can tell us all about that. I'll just see if there's any other questions coming through. Very quickly, Ali, have you come across anything from local elites in places like Orkney and Shetland and the Western Isles and Ireland? You already spoke a little bit about kind of the reception in Ireland, but what's the reception in places like the Western Isles and Northern Isles to this, you know, tightening of royal control? Are people buying into it, or is there a resistance there and a kind of clash of identities?
Oh, that could take me days, Andrew. Great question. There's always a resistance to intervention. Because essentially they don't want it on a level. It's like, look, you know, you turn up once every 2 decades or something and do something, and then you disappear again, and it comes back to, you know, local matters become much more important. James V, the increase of crown rental was not, they did not like that. You know, some places were having to pay rent they'd never paid rent before. And I've argued elsewhere that that's kind of fed directly into the Donald Dhu rebellion that then happens in 1545, that resentment leads to the support that he got. Because, you know, Donald Dhu has, you know, he's not been around for 40 odd years, you know, and I don't think any Highland chief really believes the restoration of the lordship is feasible. And it's almost like the Irish at that stage, actually, do they want it? Because are they all going to acknowledge those laid down? I doubt it very much. But again, it becomes a vehicle, I think, for an expression of discontent on the part of the crown. Although by that stage, James is dead, and it's more it's a expression of discontent with the council and largely Argyll at that point. I mean, by the time you get, I suppose I would draw parallels obviously with James VI. Again, royal intervention isn't particularly welcomed, because it always means, you know, submissions, warding, or hostages being sent to the lowlands, or, you know, some effort, well yeah, okay, we'll pay rent or we'll pay arrears or something, and then they disappear, and you just go back to normal. And I've been reflecting on the statutes of Iona. Sorry, I'm way off on a tangent now. It's nothing to do with the 1530s. A lot more, and I still, even then, I think it's not until the statutes are renewed until in 1616 that's when there is a sustained effort at royal intervention in the region. I still think the statutes of Iona, on the back of plantation and everything else he's doing, is James just being pragmatic, reacting to what's happening at the time. Whereas 1616, I think there's a much more decisive, no, okay, now I've had enough. Now I'm actually going to do something. So there is that clash of identities, but I think it runs deeper. And I've also got this long-standing interest in terms of how they understand their relationship to the land and sea. Whereas the Crown is extractive. You know, they want to extract mining, they want to protect fishing because they want the revenues for the kingdom, they want it for trade, all of that. I think there is a different approach, and I could be completely wrong on this, I'm still figuring this out, in terms of an understanding that there is a responsibility to the land and sea and the economic resources of it. They will exploit it, sure, but they also understand there's a responsibility there. And so, yeah, I think Crown intervention is always unwelcome, unless it's in your benefit. Like Ian McIan's of Ard na Merchan in the very end of the 15th century, when they arrest John MacDonald and his sons, and they're hanged at Burmuir. He then receives lands, although he's then later murdered by 2 other Islanders because of what he's done. So not great. But unless it's in your interest, I don't think Crown intervention is ever really welcome, because it's sporadic, it's intermittent, and it always, you know, demands something of you, and it feeds that cycle of kind of the Crown kind of go, okay, now we're going to do something because we're fed up, and you submit and you make promises and you pay rents, and then it kind of all goes back to normal after a couple of years, and you have that ongoing cycle. It's a cycle that I think James VI by the early 17th century is getting fed up with. And just going, yeah, probably because he's been around and been through the cycle a few more times. Yeah. Sorry, that was a very long, rambling answer.
No, very interesting. So you went to the 17th century, so you had me hooked anyway. I'll just check the chat. We are coming to an end, so but if anyone does have a final question, we can pop that in. I'll just give that a wee minute in case people are furiously typing.
I'm happy for any comments and indeed criticism. Like I said, the Orkney, Shetland, Denmark-Norway stuff is really brand new for me. So I feel a little bit not on very solid ground when I'm on it. I found it absolutely fascinating. And I just, as much as I'm much happier with James VI, I just can't leave James V alone and what he's up to on this expedition. I find it really interesting. So. But I promise, Kate, I'm really not doing much more with it. It's all yours. I'm delighted you. I can't wait to see what you come up with, because there's so much out there.
I think that might be us then, if there's no other questions coming through. In which case, I will just draw the. That's Kate just saying, "No, I need you." Such a fascinating angle. I'll just draw things to a close then just now. So first and foremost, thank you very much, Ali, for giving up your Thursday evening, coming and speaking to us, and thank you to everyone for tuning in tonight. Unbelievably, this is the final instalment of the winter portion of the Institute's seminar series, but we'll be back in January with an even bigger schedule of talks, which we'll be releasing in December. So keep your eyes on your emails and on Twitter and things like that for an update. But once again, I'd like everyone to join me in an awkward online round of applause for Ali. Thank you very much for a fantastic paper. Thank you all for tuning in. And yes, we'll see you after the new year. So if we don't see you before then, have a lovely Christmas and Happy New Year.